Hey everyone, my name is Karel, and today we're going to be taking another look at lasers. This time we're going to be going over some demo lasers and some examples of things that you can pull off with the very versatile but relatively simple laser systems. First off, we've got this, what I like to call a blind laser over here. This is a goofy little contraption that costs about 170 materials, if I've calculated this right, that will actually basically stop the majority of infrared, laser designated, and laser beam rider missiles. Specifically, those three. Other missile types will not be affected by this in the slightest, but those particular types of missiles will get almost entirely stopped by this tiny little device. If you can build multiples of these and spread them out over your hull, so much the better. In fact, these tiny little things only consume 50 power apiece. They don't actually shoot down the missiles, rather they blind the guidance on the missiles and prevent them from locking onto your vehicle effectively. In order to show you how this works, I've got a heat decoy over here. I'm just going to ramp up the settings on that, and I'm going to shut down this damage LAMS system over here, and I'm going to fly out into the distance, and we're going to just load up a very basic infrared missile drone. We'll set this on the Onyx Watch, and we'll also turn God mode on our local vehicle, and let's take a look. So, first thing you can see, those missiles just seem to be kind of turning in and then they fly off into the distance, which is weird. Also, let's turn off our offensive laser here. Getting detection on those this particular little drone is quite difficult as it is. So we have another volley here coming in. You can see the LAMS occasionally switching targets. It doesn't do a perfect job, and if this vehicle was moving, it would be much more effective. Likewise, if the laser node was actually pointed towards the incoming missiles, it would be even more effective. But overall, it does a pretty acceptable job of keeping these medium infrared missiles from coming really anywhere close. Very effective, very cheap, well worth including on almost every single vehicle you produce, if only for those reasons. Of note with this specifically is that the laser munition defense here, I've set the range below which to engage to 1,000 meters because it doesn't really matter how close the missile is. We're not intending to damage it, so the extreme damage fall off over distance of the laser munition defense or the LAMS node basically means nothing. We don't care about that. However, we do want it to target missiles only because we're not going to be shooting down shells with this. Don't even try. Moving on to the next laser in the bunch, we have a damage LAMS. This LAMS is intended to shoot down cannon shells and missiles, and it does so fairly effectively. We've got a 1 Q switch system here. We've got quite a bit of storage and relatively little charging capacity. If you think about how cannon shells and lasers tend to come in, or rather cannon shells and missiles, those types of damage are generally going to come in bursts, right? You're going to get a volley of missiles in, and then you'll have some time to recharge. This type of LAMS will take a while to recharge fully, but it's going to stop a few missiles fairly effectively. This particular system is not nearly powerful enough to stop even the majority of missiles from a well-tuned launcher. Don't expect it to do so. You're better off in those cases using flak. You're better off using decoys or any of the missile interceptors. Any of the other anti-missile systems are going to serve you better than a damage LAMS. But what this can do that no other type of LAMS can do is shoot down cannon shells. So usually when I'm building a vehicle that has other types of missile defense in place, I will take the laser munition defense here and I will turn it to target shells only, because LAMS is the only thing that can target cannon shells, which makes it uniquely suited to shooting down those pesky cannon shells that are incoming. Also worth noting, cannon shells that have a lot of armor pierce tend to be fairly resistant, and also cannon shells that are low diameter, you're not going to be able to detect those very far away, and they're unlikely to do very much damage to you if they do hit, if you have a properly armored and shielded vehicle. So generally speaking, I like to set some sort of minimum diameter here. I also like to set a very strict maximum range, because if we go too high on the range gate, then we end up losing a ton of damage. If we mouse over the laser munition defense here, you notice the damage at 500 meters is 60.5%, so we are starting to lose 40% damage at just 500 meters out. 100 meters out, we're not losing all that much damage, but this laser or this particular LAM system does not have enough damage to spare that we can afford to just go throwing it away, attempting to shoot down things that we might not one-hit. So yeah, we definitely want to very carefully gate the range that we're going to engage, even though this will make sure that we are not able to shoot down missiles in 100% of cases when we have a volley of missiles incoming, or a volley of cannon shells for that matter. So yeah, that is both an upside and a downside. Also, of particular note with this design, there is a frequency doubler on here. Frequency doublers are very expensive at 250 materials apiece, so you want to be sparing with these. However, missiles and cannon shells do have some amount of armor on them. If you do not include a frequency doubler with a damage LAMs, you will not deal much damage to that shell or that missile. So in order to demonstrate this against missiles, I'm going to bring out a missile radar drone. The blind LAMs that we had over there will not be effective against this in the slightest, so we'll have to shoot down the missiles. But we're only going to get one out of the group of 3 because this thing is set to 1Q and it's just not able to shoot down missiles that quickly. If I was to add more Q switches here, I might be able to shoot down more of the missiles. Adding more Q switches in this particular system does not do a whole lot, one way or another. You can see that I was just able to shoot down one missile still. You're not really changing how the damage output of the laser is formed with multiple Q switches unless you have a charge rate great enough that your storage is always going to be reaching capacity constantly. It's just not really going to happen. So don't bother with the multiple Q switches unless you have a lot more charging capacity than this. Over here, we can start dealing with more Q switches potentially with a larger laser, but definitely not for this very basic damage LAMs. The next laser in line over here is a continuous laser system. Continuous lasers get a bonus to armor piercing, but a penalty to damage. So they're not going to do quite as much actual physical damage, but you can get away with much fewer frequency doublers on here. That can be very valuable, but it comes with a number of downsides. First, you have to hold the beam on a specific point on the target in order to make good use of that damage. When you're thinking about a typical vehicle fight, you don't win the vehicle fight by simply destroying armor. And that's what you're going to do the majority of the time with a continuous damage laser. You're going to be hitting armor. This doesn't have the area of effect to effectively strip off fragile components off the outside of a vehicle unless the entirety of the outside of that vehicle is coated in fragile components. So you're basically going to be relying on punching through armor and getting to the squishy, juicy inner bits of a vehicle. But a continuous beam laser just doesn't have the punch to get that done. We're dealing with this 49 damage a shot. Granted, we're hitting 40 times a second, so we're actually dealing more along the lines of 1600 damage per second. And that's pretty respectable, but if that damage per second is spread out over the surface of a vehicle, and more specifically over the surface of armor, it will do nothing whatsoever. To demonstrate this, I'm going to spawn in an armor test block, and we're just going to take some shots and see how it performs. Alright, so I've spawned in our armor block here, and you can see over on the left I've got fairly light armor that is a single metal beam thick. If I start just firing at that, it goes through pretty quickly and starts getting to the juicy inner bits. However, you'll note if I start sweeping this across, I'm not really doing anything whatsoever. So if I'm dealing with a fast maneuverable enemy vehicle, it's going to take me quite some time to punch through even a single layer of metal, simply because the continuous beam laser is not getting enough damage output to really do much to that armor. I just noticed here that I am not getting all of my power available because that heat decoy is on. So let's give that another try, and again we're just going to kind of sweep over here. And you can see we're not even dealing well with this single layer of metal. However, if I was to hold this steady on a target, I can try punching through the 2 layers of metal here, and you can see we can go through that respectively quickly. We go through some moderate armor here. You can tell I can get through that, again, pretty respectably. We start hitting heavy. we're going to start dealing less and less damage. And that took us about 8 seconds to get through all the way. And then the heaviest armor that I've got over there, let's actually hit the armor, shall we? You can tell that this is taking quite some time to get through before we actually manage to hit that engine block in the back. So yeah, this particular laser design, you have to hold steady on the target. Thus, it is best when used on slow vehicles against slow vehicles. In those cases, the armor-piercing bonus comes into play very effectively, because typically slow vehicles are going to be very heavily armored, right? They have to be in order to resist damage. So the frequency doublers here are going to do an excellent job, but I don't want to have too many of them on there because they're expensive. So I can go with a continuous damage laser. I probably have the power and the resources to be able to apply to that continuous damage laser in order to be able to punch through fairly heavy armor and actually start dealing damage to internal components if this is mounted on a large vehicle. So yeah, continuous, great for large, slow things, maybe not so much for fast, rapidly maneuvering vehicles. Over here, we've got a single pulsed damage laser, and this damage laser, again, is using one Q switch. Now, 1Q lasers have a very interesting property in that you can set these up to fire as slowly as you want. Normally, a single Q switch will force you to fire at the rate of 1 shot per second, but we can tinker with that, right? We can come up to the laser combiners and we can go into this laser settings and we can tell it to hold fire if it doesn't have enough energy to fire a full shot. Okay, that's great, but there's other things at play here. Alright, so I'd like to demonstrate one other oddity about these laser systems. And to do this, I've put up a twin laser combiner system up here, and we're going to take a look at this here. We're going to go into laser settings and set this to hold fire below 100% energy. And we're going to do this for both of these. Now, what this system is going to do, this is going to only fire one of the two lasers. And you can see here, we're dealing a fair bit of damage, and we're breaking a metal beam a shot, but it's nothing particularly too special. We're only breaking one metal beam a shot. If I was to go over here and fire at this 2-layer thick metal armor, we can fire at that. Again, only one metal beam a shot. I'm going to repair this target up here, and we're going to take a look at another option. Alright, so I've repaired our armor chunk. Let's go ahead and turn the hold fire below energy back down to 0 on these laser combiners. And we're going to do something that we cannot personally test ourselves very easily. We're going to go into the local weapon controller here, and we're going to hit Q on that. And in fact, I've already set this up. We've got a maximum fire rate of 0.5. So what that's going to do is say that we cannot fire this faster than once every half second. So we have a fire rate of 1 shot every 2 seconds. And I'm going to go ahead and move away so I relinquish control of the turret. And what we're going to do is go over here and set this to be an enemy simulator. We're going to simulate this laser beam as an enemy. Then we're going to come back over here and we're going to enable this wireless receiver. So now immediately you can tell we are firing both of those beams. They're both firing every single time. And they're targeting the same spot. And they're breaking through quite a bit of armor. In fact, they're breaking through a lot of armor. They're going through that heavy armor like it's pretty much nothing. However, we're still draining out energy here. So let's go ahead and reduce the fire rate still further. And we're going to go down to let's go to 0.3. So this will be roughly a shot every, a little less than once every 3 seconds. And you can see we are charging a bit. And it looks like we are reaching pretty much a steady state, and we're getting about 2,400 damage a shot, which is about what we're aiming for. Generally speaking, you want exactly enough damage at a minimum on a damage laser to break one metal beam with every shot. The metal beam has 2,100 health, and we're going to lose some damage from attenuation, so having 2,400 damage a shot sounds actually pretty reasonable. However, these laser combiners, since there are 2 of them here, are actually dealing more damage than you would expect. normally you would expect that one of these is going to be firing a less powerful shot. So if I had one beam broken before with the laser combiners being set to hold fire until they had a 100% charge, you would expect that if I fire both of these, then I'm not going to break more than one beam, right? But if I fire there, I just broke two beams and very significantly damaged the ones behind them. So you can see that I'm not necessarily losing too much damage there by virtue of having multiple combiners on there. Each individual laser beam is doing more or less full damage. And that's very interesting to note because it means that adding more combiners is actually a good way of increasing your damage output. So if I can keep firing here, you can see we will get through a single layer of light armor and break into the stone behind it pretty well. If I go out into the heavier armor, I'm going to do almost exactly the same thing. And if I go out to my heaviest armor over here, you can see I do, again, exactly the same thing. There's a reason for this. This particular armor does not rely too heavily on stacked armor class. It does have some of it in there, mind you, but this particular damage laser has enough armor pierce on it. In fact, if I look at that, I can see on the actual laser block itself, I have 54.2 armor pierce. So the 54.2 armor pierce is going to ensure that I am pretty much going straight through that armor, and really at that point the only thing that matters is the actual damage statistic of the laser itself. So yeah, very useful to have plenty of armor piercing on there, because it means you don't need to waste as much energy on charging your laser. Another general principle of laser design, if you're using a pulsed design, you can get away with storage cavities. On a continuous laser, you might want one storage cavity, maybe a destabilizer. Generally, you don't want to go too heavy into the storage, because on a continuous laser system, the storage is basically just going to get drained out unless you have enough cavities to support it. On a single Q damage laser, then you can afford to pack more and more storage in. In fact, if I wanted to, I could go so far as to do something like this, and I would have just an absolute ton of storage in there. It's going to take me a long time to charge up for a shot. Alright, so a few other things of note here. Generally, you can get away with a lot more storage on a single Q damage laser. That is because you can turn the fire rate down as low as you want to, and your charge rate can be basically whatever your vehicle can support. That lets you store up a massive amount of damage and channel it into a single devastating punch. Like right here, we've got 6180 cavity energy used per shot. That is going to punch through multiple layers of metal armor and reach juicy inner bits of a vehicle fairly effectively. But that's going to also take a long time to charge, so you've got kind of a balancing act there. I could charge faster and have more storage, or I could charge slower and have a better chance of reaching the actual internal critical components of a vehicle and thus disabling or dealing critical damage to that vehicle in a single shot. Choice is pretty much up to you. Personally, I tend to favor the single shot high damage punch lasers rather than a multiple Q switch cavity that's not going to have quite as much punch to it. Reason for that being, I want to get through any armor and deal damage to the internal components of a vehicle. Again, we're not talking about stripping off sensitive external components with lasers for the most part. We want to get into the inner guts of the vehicle, because that's where we're going to, by breaking single blocks, we're going to be able to actually disable a vehicle. In fact, that's probably the only way we're going to be able to do so with a damaged laser in a fairly efficient amount of time, unless we're just pumping a ton of energy into that laser. So large amount of storage cavities on damage lasers, especially if you're going for a single Q switch. Also, with single Q lasers, you're going to need quite a few frequency doublers in order to bring the armor piercing up to the point where it is perfectly relevant. So a lot of tuning, a lot of tweaking there, but not necessarily a whole lot of complexity. You may also, in these systems, want to double up and build out, say, some more connectors and another coupler and another set of stuff to charge up another beam there. Charging multiple beams at once is pretty effective in terms of increasing your overall laser throughput, and you won't need to build the entire set of frequency doublers for each individual cavity. You only need those on one. So we've looked at a lot of different things in respect to these 4 different lasers here. Obviously there's more designs. You can expand these, you can make them bigger, you can make them smaller, you can do whatever you want to with these particular systems. There's really not a whole lot of complexity here compared to some of the other systems. There's just a lot of tweaking and fine-tuning to make sure that these are well optimized. But what we do have here is also some interesting stuff upcoming in patches. So the From the Depths developers, at least as of the recording of this tutorial, have been talking about reducing the effective efficiency of fuel engines. And right now, fuel engines are just absurdly efficient. They basically sip fuel to produce, huge amounts of power. If they pull off what they're talking about, they're going to end up reducing the efficiency of the fuel engines considerably, and in turn, they are going to take the laser components and make these more efficient per component. That will decrease the cost and size of the laser, presumably at the expense of increasing the amount of cost and size of your fuel processing and refining and storage on your vehicle. So yeah, your laser systems will get smaller, your gas engines will get much larger, potentially. That's what they're talking about at the moment. That may change in the future, but that's something to be aware of when you're designing laser systems right now. Keep an eye out for that in the future, and hopefully the developers will not make things too terribly crazy and break all of our vehicles. I think that's all for now, so thanks for watching, and hopefully I will see you next time.